Hello, my name is Denny Paul May, and I'm one of the due process consultants at KVEC, and I would like to welcome you to the ARC Chairperson Training. So what I was about to say, just kind of overview, kind of cap what we're talking about. We're going to provide some perspective with just looking quickly at what the laws are that really govern us and where they come from. And then, we're going to really get into the meat of what we're going to talk about today around ARC meetings. And, some tips, what to do, what not to do. A lot of this information, I'm going to be honest, comes from Teresa Combs, our person that, if you've never had her training, she is tremendous. She does a much better job of explaining this stuff, but I'm going to try to go through it with you and make sure that, we hit all the high points. But like I said, we have several slides. So some of this stuff we're going to hit really quickly. And if you have questions, please put it in the chat. If you need to stop us, use your tools to do that. I think now we've had at least some experience with Zoom, and so we would certainly encourage you to use the tools, use the annotation, use the hand raise, use the thumbs up, whatever it is that you feel like you need to communicate with us to make this meeting as interactive as possible. Please do so. But up here, you'll see that, we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act that, for the most part, has been governing us over the last 16 or 18 years. It really came into fruition in the mid-'70s with Public Law 94-142, and then it morphed into this law, and it has been authorized and reauthorized. I think 97, it was authorized by the federal government and by Congress. And it is a law that has to be reauthorized every so often. So 2004, we had a big reauthorization. And then 2008, they did some things with it. So this law, the IDEA law, really is the meat and potatoes of what we do. And it's the one that says that every student with a disability that is eligible for special education actually is afforded the right to have a free, appropriate public education. We're going to talk about that phrase, free. We sometimes refer to it as FAPE, but we're going to talk about that quite a bit today as we move through. Every Student Succeeds Act, it really replaced a few years back the No Child Left Behind, the Nickleby Law. And this, kind of gave states some flexibility in how they wanted to assess their students. But the big thing it did is it continued to make sure that students with disabilities were assessed just like everyone else. And it's where your TSI and your CSI schools came from. It also has a great emphasis on, places a great emphasis on transition. And we're going to talk about transition some today. So I just wanted to throw that out there a little bit. The Americans with Disabilities Act also governs us as a disability law. And then we have Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is a little bit different, but it certainly has to do, it's a civil rights law that we have to abide by because we receive federal funding, and we need to make sure that we're abiding by what's included in Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So in 2008, they reauthorized 504 law, and that kind of expanded 504 law. And 504 before was about putting people on a level playing field in terms of medical issues. If you had a medical issue, we had to make some accommodations and make a plan for providing those services for those students. And it goes much deeper than that, and I'm being very simplistic, but I just wanted to kind of mention it a little bit here. I know that we have some students in our schools that are 504, and it did expand in 2008 to include reading and writing and math. If you have a limit on a life activity, and it included reading, writing, and math. And so there was some expansion of the 504 law, and that's one of the avenues that you can get accommodations on state and district tests. And so we realized that as well. The thing about 504 to remember, as opposed to maybe having an IEP, is those students, we don't receive any funding to provide those services. So, you need to really think about that when you're looking at the eligibility sections and really determine what's best for that student and what's most appropriate for that student. We don't want you just to put someone in special ed because you don't get funding for it, but it's certainly something to think about as we move through. And then, of course, there's the Family Education Rights to Privacy Act, the FERPA law, which is much like the HIPAA law that you would experience if you went to a doctor. But this has to do with protection of confidential information, including registry information around a student's file. And, where we really can get down a rabbit hole with that is if we share that information without consent. And that's registry information. That's their, demographic information that you would see at the top of an IEP. And so, you just really need to be careful about that. In this pandemic that we're currently operating in, there's been some questions that come up. There's quite a bit of guidance around that from KDE. The thing that I would say to you in conducting ARC meetings, if you're going to have outside agencies or if you're going to release any type of information that's demographic in nature, and you're also taking a chance on revealing, who is disabled in the group, then you need to make sure that you have permission from the parent to do so. So that's something to think about as we move through, and we'll talk more about that as we move on. So the legal background for special education, we have federal law that governs us, and IDEA was updated, like I said, in 2004. We have state laws, the Kentucky Administrative Regulations, or KARs, which were updated in 2008. And those laws are at the federal level in terms of what is expected. The federal law just really talks a lot about free, appropriate public education and what you have to do for students with disabilities. And it really encapsulates the IEP. It really captures eligibility, and it really looks at child find. And, as a local education agency, we have a responsibility to find students that have disabilities and seek them out, evaluate them, and serve them. So it's very, very important that we keep that in mind as we move through. State law then goes a little deeper and really defines exactly what's expected in the IEP, what's expected in present levels. And we're going to go into that in detail here in just a few minutes. Local school district policies are updated annually as needed. You do have local policies and procedures that lots of times your district will have Kentucky School Boards Association do those policies for you. And you've got a policy person that's in charge of having those policies heard by the BOE there at your local level. And those policies are then become part of how you operate. And some of those things are left out of state law. Some of those things are left out of federal law, and you're able to go above and beyond in serving students with disabilities. You cannot take away from any of the laws above. You can't leave out things that are mandated to the federal level. You cannot leave things out that are mandated to the state level at the local level, but you can certainly add to and do more for students with disabilities. So when you get into that legalese, it's sometimes good to have your board attorney weigh in on some things if you have questions, or if you can always get up with myself or Brenda Combs. And then, of course, we have the ability, and I think Jonathan does too, to get a hold of Teresa Combs as well. So, that's your legal background for that. Ideal eligibility, Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act of 2004. It's a federal education law, and students must meet the criteria for one of the 14 disability categories in Kentucky. I will say this, there's only 13 categories that are mentioned at the federal level, but we add developmental delay as a category in Kentucky. So that's where you get 14 disability categories. And then we must show how the disability adversely affects the educational performance to a degree that the students are consistently below those of their same age peers. And the student must also need specially designed instruction and related services. That's a little bit of the difference between a 504 student and an IEP student. In order to be eligible in the state of Kentucky, you must meet the criteria of one of those categories. You must have an adverse effect on educational performance that's markedly, consistently below those of similar age peers, and then you have to need that specially designed instruction in order to matriculate and also make progress on those goals. So, and when I say matriculate, I mean to move from grade to grade. So that's really that's a real simplistic view of eligibility. We know that it goes much deeper than that, and that, if you are struggling as an ARC chairperson with trying to determine whether or not a student is eligible, please reach out to Jonathan, myself, or Brenda, and let us assist you in that. That's one situation that you don't want to make that decision on your own. That needs to be made by the chair, by the ARC team, not by the chairperson alone. So that's something to keep in mind as we move through the day. Again, this free appropriate public education. There's been a lot of talk about free appropriate public education, especially since we ramped up what's expected for a free appropriate public education in terms of development of an IEP. We're going to talk about a couple of cases today, and maybe even a few more cases than a couple, but the two main cases we're going to talk about is Raleigh and ENDREW. And as we talk about those, we realize that we have an obligation to provide an appropriate education, not just a free education that just meets a minimum standard. And we do this, free means at no expense to the parent. So we, when we're talking about ARC, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but when we're talking about having an ARC meeting, one of the things that's a big no-no with Teresa Combs is that we never discuss money or the lack thereof in terms of what we're able to provide as a free appropriate public education for a student with disabilities. This is under public supervision and direction. So, it's our meeting, it's our services, and we're going to have a lot of say in how that goes, but the parents also have rights, and we need to make sure that the parents are included and the student is included when necessary and when appropriate. So, and it's also provided in accordance with the IEP. An appropriate education has we got a lot to say about that, and we'll talk about that more as we dive into ENDREW a little bit later. Just a little bit about what we're going to do here today. We're going to go kind of on the 55-5 rule, or maybe the 50-10 rule, depending on how we feel around that time. But we'll try to take a break about every 50 to 55 minutes and try to get you as much information as we possibly can as we move through. So there, as promised, we talk about the ENDREW case. Now, the ENDREW case, we'll talk about this later too in a little bit more detail. But this whole idea about being a reasonably calculated program, the ENDREW case was a case where the student was severely autistic, and the student, and you've probably heard this story before, but it really, really dominates what we do for free appropriate public education and providing an IEP that's both reasonably calculated and enables the student to make progress and is appropriately ambitious in light of the individual student circumstances. But what got the folks with ENDREW in trouble, they were providing ENDREW with an IEP that was just a minimum base level IEP with really no progress monitoring, with really no updates, with no positive behavior intervention included. And so they really went down a rabbit hole with that student. He was in there from the time that he was about 3 years old till about the 5th grade. And he'd had basically the same IEP, the same goals. And they were just basic. They were really just probably what I want to say is, I hate to use this phrase, but they were basically just taking care of his needs. You know what I'm saying? Just providing a service there. He was coming to school, but they were really not working to change his behavior any at all. And his behavior, what happens with students as they get older? They get harder to handle. They get more difficult. And the parents were really at a crossroads. And so they decided to go to the private school down the road during the summer. And the first thing the private school did was a functional behavioral assessment. They started looking at what, the function of the behavior was, what was happening before the behavior, what was happening during the behavior, what was happening, the consequences, what was the function of the behavior. And they developed a behavior intervention plan and started, taking some data and and really looking at replacing those negative behaviors. He was hitting his head, he was running away, he was doing some of the things that you would consider with a severely autistic kid as being typical. And the first thing they noticed was that his behavior improved. And he'd been there just a short time. And so they went back to the school and said, you know what? We would like for you to pay for our student, for our son to stay at this placement, because he's been here since 3. He's not made any progress. You've basically copied and pasted the goals, copied and pasted present levels. Not a lot's changed with the IEP. This thing went to the lower courts. The lower courts held for the school system because they were looking at the Raleigh case, and they were saying all you have to provide for a student is a Chevrolet, not a Cadillac. The Supreme Court stopped short of providing a Cadillac here, but they did ramp up what was expected. And we've been kind of operating in Kentucky with this kind of thinking as far as an IEP anyway over the last few years. But the ENDREW case really, really speaks to a free, appropriate public education and what is appropriate for an IEP. So it enables the student to make progress. It enables the student to matriculate from grade to grade. It enables the student to have goals that are appropriately ambitious in light of their unique circumstances. So it's designed, it's an individualized program that's designed for that student. Really get yourself in trouble if you see a lot of IEPs that are exactly the same in your school. You really get yourself into trouble if the goals are exactly the same. And we realize that standards-based IEPs make some similarity as far as what we do with goals. And we have to consider standards-based IEPs. We have to consider standards in the state of Kentucky as far as developing the IEP around what is needed. But we need to stay away from copying and pasting. We need to stay away from present levels that never change. And that's really what happened. So the Supreme Court heard this. Justice Roberts gave the majority opinion on this. And he said, you know, only providing a minimum floor of opportunity for a student is really providing no education at all. And it's really made us rethink and relook at how we provide an appropriate program. One of the other things that I would be remiss in mentioning, if I didn't mention this, is the fact that parents and the input that parents give is so vital. In the ENDREW case, the parent had not given any input into the development of the IEP. So when I train during IEP, I always tell my folks, please, when you get to that section and you're thinking about including the parent, you got to ask that parent some open-ended questions and get some back and forth and capture that in the conference summary. And when you do that, you're going to satisfy what it means to include the parent in the free, appropriate public education, and satisfy what it means to include the parent in the development of the IEP. That's federal law. That goes all the way to the federal level. That's in our state laws. It's in your local policies and procedures. So it's very, very, very important that we understand that. Every child should have a chance to meet challenging objectives. The ARC team is responsible for ensuring the program is designed to meet the test articulated by the Supreme Court. And that test is that it's reasonably calculated, that we've considered data, and we've done that as a team. We've looked at the RTI data. We've looked at the overall skill levels of the student. We've determined what those skill levels are, and we've funneled it down to discrete skills. And we've really looked at developing the IEP appropriately. And we've made those goals ambitious enough that the student's going to be challenged right where they are. We meet that student where they are. And we also encapsulate that with the fact that we got to include standards in. So we're looking at those standards as a backdrop to kind of guide us. Those standards and the regular ed teacher's role in the ARC meeting is to provide a look at what a typical similar age student would actually be performing. And then we're going to say where the adverse effect comes in is how far we're away from that. And then we're going to have to determine how we're that far away. And so that's certainly something to think about and something to keep in mind. Now, the other big law that comes out of IDEA is child fine. It's affirmative. It's ongoing obligation of the states and LEA'S It's an affirmative, ongoing obligation of the states and LEAs to identify, locate, and evaluate anyone who's disabled and may be in need of special education and related services. So, you know, if we, as a chairperson, you know, we realize you're not the special education teacher in most cases, and you wouldn't be in any case. You can't serve both roles in an ARC meeting. So you got to have a chairperson. We're going to talk about membership later. But when we're talking about child find law, if you know the student in your school, you know, you really have an obligation. You have an ethical obligation, really, even if you want to go that far, to make that that student and make the special education ARC team aware and get that referral rolling when you need to, because it is part of federal law that we seek out and find, identify, locate, and evaluate anyone who we consider or suspect that might have a disability. So placement. Placement's another one of the big rocks when we talk about special education. Placement refers to what type of setting the student learns. And the IEP needs and services drives placement. So what I mean by that is we develop the IEP if the student's eligible, and we develop that IEP, and from that IEP, the services needs then is determine what setting the student is going to receive those services in. The IEP team selects the placement based on the IEP. So that's a big piece of information to understand. As you know, if you haven't been involved in special education very much, IEP comes first, placement comes next, and placement's based on the IEP and the service needs. We can't change those service needs. A lot of questions come up around this with, you know, location and placement. Was it a change of placement to be in a virtual setting? And the answer is definitively no. It is not a change of placement. It's a change of location. And so we don't change the IEP. We don't go back and have a bunch of ARC meetings just because we're having a pandemic. We continue to try to provide what the student needs, no matter what the cost, no matter what it is that we need to be doing. We don't need to change a lot of things just because of the pandemic. And so I wanted to say that. Least restrictive environment is best described as the environment where an eligible student will have the most exposure to students without disabilities while still receiving an appropriate education. So if the student's in a co-teaching setting, you know, certainly you need to, in the virtual realm, you need to try to, you know, educate that student some with peers that are not disabled. And, you know, that's certainly a difficult task, but it's certainly something that we need to consider. LEAs have an obligation to have a continuum of placement options available. Now, I really want you to listen. I want you to perk your ears up on this. It is emphatically illegal to say we're going to do all co-teaching and not have a resource room. That is an obligation of a local education agency, is to have all those continuum of placement options made available. Now, I started a Google site for us. And in that Google site, hopefully you got that QR code, or you got that code in order to be able to join that. In that Google Classroom that I set up for us, I placed a continuum of placement options. I'm not going to go over those right now. I'm not going to talk to that. We got a lot of ground to cover. That's something you can read for yourself, but it basically says we got to consider full-time regular education for even students that have disabilities. We have to consider that and then determine what are the reasons that we need to move that student to a more restricted environment. And we have to tell in our placement decisions why we've moved that student. And those options are dictated by the needs stated in the IEP in your district. And then we would drop down to the next continuum of placement options, and we would see that we have a part-time situation. And then we have also, then we would have, you know, that would be a situation where we could have, you know, an IEP in place where a student needs some time in the regular classroom, some time in a co-teaching setting, and maybe even some time in a resource setting. It is, again, I'm going to say this, you cannot have a situation where every student in your building is just going to fall into co-teaching, because that's not appropriate. Okay, so you need to be thinking about that and whatever changes you need to make, I would be thinking about that, because that is emphatically illegal to say we're all going to co-teaching, because we have to let the IEP drive our continuum placement options. And those students' needs have to drive that placement decision. So the translation is, let's access the document in Google Classroom, continuum of placement options. Make sure you go over there and read that thing. It's there for you. The Google Classroom is there, and we've put some documents in there for your own reading and to kind of extend this meeting a little bit. So, and we'll, keep that thing open as an open platform for you, and we'll put things in there as they become available. I think there's 2 or 3 documents in there right now, so please use that. So think about your own district. Think about where we are in this provision. If we had a lot of time, we might go into a breakout session here and say, let's really discuss where we are with this. We also then would have, the full-time self-contained classroom available. We're talking about, our students that are low incidence, students that have disabilities where they would not, the least restrictive environment for that student may not be the regular classroom. But we certainly have students that are in that self-contained classroom for a big part of the day that also go to some elective classes. And so that would be an appropriate setting as well. And then we have some students that need to remain in that self-contained classroom all day long. And then, of course, we would have home hospital as a consideration. And, then also, for lack of a better way of saying it, we would have incarceration as a possible setting, or maybe an alternative school as a possible setting. So those continuum placement options should be available in your district. So implementing services. IDEA requires that school ARC teams develop reasonably calculated IEPs. It also requires that schools and ARC teams ensure that implementation occurs as written. And so what we mean by that is that the IEP really drives what we do, and that we're making the best good faith effort, even in a pandemic, to make sure that we're implementing as written the IEP. This is that we must provide all services, instruction, supports, and accommodations listed in the IEP. Another big piece that I didn't mention as far as the ENDREW case was the fact that there was not any progress monitoring available. I've said this, and I'm going to say it again. This is one of my go-tos. Brendan Dion sent us to a national meeting last year. It's really about this time of year. And we attended a session with an attorney who spends his time just defending school districts who get themselves into trouble over not appropriately providing services and things of that nature. And so he says one of the first things that he does when he does an investigation, if there's a complaint filed against a school district, is he goes in and he looks at the due process file, and he asks the teacher that's in charge of that student's file, where is your data? Where is your progress monitoring? And so in order to say that we've definitively provided FAPE, we must have data-driven decisions. We must have progress monitoring. It's a requirement of all teachers. Your regular ed teachers should be doing progress monitoring on their students as well. RTI is universal. You should be in some tier, either 1, 2, or 3, if you're not in special education. And then if you're in special education and you have other areas that you need to be in a tier, you would certainly fall into that. So every teacher has the requirement to do progress monitoring, and we need data. So what this attorney said to us was, if we don't have the data, he would go back to the superintendent and say, go ahead and write the check. Let's settle, because we don't have data to support anything that we said we were going to do. And that's what makes an appropriate, free, appropriate public education. That's part of it. We're going to have an IEP that's reasonably calculated, ambitious, and it really challenges and is standards-based and really challenges that student in light of their unique circumstances. But we also have to have some data around those goals, because the the federal law says that you have to progress monitor annual goals as often as you progress monitor or provide grades or report cards to students with without disabilities or students that do not have disabilities. So regular ed teachers must measure progress toward grade level standards and intervention services. Special ed teachers must measure progress toward annual goals. It's the law, and it's the only definitive proof that we have that we've implemented and done what we said we were going to do. So that's a big part of free appropriate public education. So if you have caseloads and you know those caseloads, as chairpersons, as the overseers at your school of what's going on in special education, you should be placing the tools in the hands of those teachers to be able to progress monitor and making sure that everyone in your school is progress monitoring. So just wanted to throw that out there. Data should drive decisions. If students with disabilities, if a student with a disability is not making sufficient progress, reconvene and adjust. We talked a lot about that in the manifestation determination review training. The fact that if your student's not making progress on his behavior, then we should be reconvening before they hit the 11th day, right? And we should be looking to adjust those goals. Same goes with academics. If they're not making progress, we should be constantly surveying that data, analyzing the data, and making decisions that in fact will inform our instruction and will also provide the student with what they need. We also have short-term objectives in your local policies and procedures. It says that you have short-term objectives that go along with those annual goals. Now, the question comes up lots of times in IEP training, should we be monitoring those short-term objectives? Well, I don't see how you cannot do that and effectively do the annual goals. If those are small pieces of the overall annual goal, we're probably going to have to monitor those as well. Now, we don't have to report data on those. We don't have to send progress reports on short-term objectives. So there's a lot less work to do, but certainly in our formative assessment, in our cumulative, in our formative assessments, in our summative assessments, we should be looking at those short-term objectives and seeing how they're making progress, and we should be monitoring those, especially when that student has significant needs. Now, at the federal level, the law says that students with significant needs also have their short-term objectives monitored. So, you know, when you're talking about a student with severe disabilities, they probably should have some short-term objectives that are being monitored, or not probably, it is in fact a law. So IDEA requires short-term objectives for alternative assessment population. Short-terms are like my running analogy. We must always do what's right for students. And if we don't have the data, we have to write the check. Okay? IEP revision. The IDEA law requires revision. The IEP is a living document. We should be revising when progress expected is not the progress achieved. Okay, so we talked a lot about this with behavior, but this also applies to academics. So we should be monitoring our progress almost daily, but at least weekly, in terms of the IEP is a live document, and if we're not making the academic success, if we're not making the progress on the goals, then we should be looking at making instructional changes, and that's part of analyzing. And we're also supposed to provide an analysis around the data that we capture. We have to have a chart, we have to have an aim line, we have to have dates at the bottom, we have to have goals set, and we have to capture that data. And then we have to look at how that student is working around short breaks in instruction, how they're working around long breaks in instruction, whether or not there's recoupment and regression issues. And so, you know, it's very, very important that we are progress monitoring and we're revising the IEP as needed. This is true for academics and behavior. Reevaluation is required every 3 years. but can and should do it sooner if needs change or requested by the parent. If the parent requests a reevaluation early, we should do it. Okay. And if we feel like we need more data, if we get into a situation where we're discussing something in an ARC meeting and there's nothing wrong with hitting the pause button in that ARC meeting and saying, you know what, we need more data before we make this decision. Does the student need this, or does the student not need this? Do we have data to support our decisions? Every decision you make inside an ARC meeting should have some data to support it if it has to do with the child's program. Some local policies allow for review of records. Some things are still required on a review of records. We got to have consent before we do formal behavioral observations. The record review document that we refer to and that we review your files with says also that you should have some discussion of progress monitoring with a record review. You know, you can say that you've got current data that's still applicable. You don't have to necessarily do a formal IQ test maybe, or a formal even academic achievement test. But things that are required are those behavioral observations. And then you're supposed to have a good discussion around progress and annual goal data. And then you're also supposed to have, you know, if the student has had any recent district or state testing, you're supposed to have that documented in your discussion of recent evaluations. It is 9:53. Why don't we take let's say about a 10-minute break. I'll see you back at 10:03. I'm going to stop my share and pause for the calls here for just a second. Okay, welcome back. We'll go ahead and get started. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. We'll try to keep our time, our breaks to what we said we would. Hopefully that will provide you with a little bit of relief in discussing some of this stuff. And this meeting is just one of those meetings where you just have to kind of go through what's there for you. And it's a lot of talk. So if you have questions, if you want to stop and please put it in the chat. We have someone monitoring the chat, and we certainly want to make this as interactive as possible, but there's just a lot of ground to cover. So I guess I'm apologizing for that. But so we're going to get going here again. I think I've already talked about this a little bit on this slide, so I'm not going to take a lot of time here, but the ENDREW F case taught us that parents have the right to participate. You know, we must invite them to the meetings. We must ask them open-ended questions, you know, those types of things. And so it's certainly, you know, very, very, very important to do what we need to do during this pandemic to get parents involved and have parents in these meetings. And, you know, we cannot defend meetings where we don't have the proper membership. We cannot defend meetings where an ARC chairperson comes in for 5 minutes, says hello, and gets up and goes back to his office or her office and does not participate. Those are the types of things that we really, really need to be careful about. You will not have a leg to stand on if someone takes you to task on that. And if you can't definitively say that you've been in that meeting for 99.9% of the time, then you're going to have a problem. So, and I know I'm preaching a little bit here to the choir because I know you all do a good job. But, you know, these clandestine, I call them clandestine meetings, are a no-no. And so I want to just go ahead and throw that out there. And not having parents involved is a no-no. Not asking parents open-ended questions about what they think their students should be working on, and that kind of thing. So certainly want you to be thinking about those things as we move through today. Now the IEP, the IEP is, we know, a blueprint for how a school will educate a student with disability. Again, we see the parent involvement piece here. ARC team designs those with the parent. Okay. Now, there's nothing wrong with having an IEP draft when you come into a meeting. And certainly I would encourage you to do that you have the data and that you have the present levels put together, but you want to make sure that you leave places to document how you've included the parent. You know, we know that we're going to have information about how the student is doing, how the disability affects him or her at school, what the team expects the student to learn in a year, and the programming services he or she will receive. Those are all those big overarching concepts that we think about. It's a blueprint. You know, we have to know how the disability is affecting the student at school. We need to be capturing the information. We want to write an IEP in such a way that if the student leaves Jones Fork and goes to Car Creek, that the person receiving that student can pick up with that IEP and it can pass the stranger test. We want the IEP written in such a way that we include information that's going to tell us about that student. And the process that the State Department allows us in writing these present levels allows us some flexibility in placing information in to this IEP that will tell us what's going on with that student. But the overarching thing is then we need to outline those expectations and keep in mind this is something that the student can and should be able to accomplish in 1 year. So current performance, present levels. Present levels performance are the foundation of every IEP. This includes academic and functional performance of the student. You know, we're not just talking about how a student reads and writes, but we're talking about how a student interacts with his peers. We're talking about how a student behaves. Is there any impact of any type of extenuating circumstance? What's the environment like at home? What are the things that are going to really impact learning? And then in the process of this, we need to identify what the strengths are for the student. We need to identify what the needs are for the student. What are the areas that the student are not doing well in regards to the standards? What are the areas that the student is struggling in? Is a student struggling in behavior as well as academics? If so, we got to identify that, and we got to come up with some data around that, and we got to come up with a baseline on those skills. And we do that through carefully evaluating the student, through carefully designing evaluations that are based on the standards, and then carefully deciding what are those skills that are going to need the most attention for the next year in order to move that student to a closer approximation of grade level or similar age performance. So it's certainly something that we take very serious. It's the foundation of a well-written IEP, and we include also recent scores. And when we talk about recent scores, when we talk about current information, current performance, we don't want a lot of old scores. Okay, so we need scores and data that's, you know, less than a year old, no more than a year old. That really impacts how the student, you know, is doing right now. And then when we're developing that adverse effect statement, that's the other piece that is required in a present level. We're looking at how the disability affects the student. Now, when we do record reviews, lots of times we'll come in, we'll review the records. One of the main problems we see with present level is we'll see that the person that's doing it will have very few numbers in their present levels. If we see present levels around the academic performance, let's say in that section, and we don't see any numbers speaking to how that student's doing based on how many performances or how many trials they've taken, if we don't have numbers, then it's likely that the baseline is not going to be there. It's likely that we're not informing that present level with progress monitoring data. You know, so we need to see numbers. Then the second error that we make and that we see a lot is lots of times inexperienced folk or folks that do not understand the part about how the disability impacts or affects the performance. We have to say how that is happening. So it's not enough to just repeat and say that the student has a disability or the IQ's saying that the cognition is at a level that they're going to struggle, or restating that the student is in fact you know, SLD or whatever, but we have to tell how that disability affects the performance. And so as an ARC chairperson, we should be looking at those IEPs and making sure that the present levels have strengths, needs, baseline data on skills, recent scores, and adverse effect that tells how that adverse effect is impacting the performance of that student. You know, we can lots of times we can compare them to the similar age performance that's expected in the standard. If we look in those standards, we'll see what they should be doing, and then we can compare and say, this is how far they are away from what they should be doing. So those are certainly things that as an ARC chairperson, you should know about. You should know about those disabilities. You should know what those 14 disabilities are. You should know, you know, what's going to make that student eligible, and the fact that an adverse effect is one piece of eligibility, along with being diagnosed with or meeting the criteria for that disability. We have to have an adverse effect statement in those present levels that makes sense and tells us how. So that I can't make that any clearer. Some present level do's and don'ts. Use clear language with quantifiable data. Again, numbers. If we're reviewing your files and there's no numbers, probably not going to be able to get baseline, and you're going to get counted off for that. It should pass the stranger test. We already talked about that a little bit. You know, it's okay when you're looking at present levels. You got a box above each area that says this is not a need or concern at this time, or the student is commensurate. If we check that commensurate box, but then still need to put things in there like I can't see anything without these eyeglasses. You see me shaking those around? I can't see anything without them. It's okay to go ahead and tell that that student needs glasses, that student needs medicine, that student needs this or that. And then also check that that area may be commensurate or not a need or concern at this time. If you do not check those boxes and you leave those boxes open, you are responsible for what I had on this previous slide. If the box is not checked, identified strengths, needs, baseline data on skills, recent scores, and adverse effect statement. Progress monitoring must be in that present level if you do not have that box checked as commensurate. But I wanted to say, though, that you can check the box as commensurate and make that stranger proof by putting information in there that every teacher would need to know about that student in order for that student to do well, make progress, and be able to be educated in the setting. Ensure that present levels are based on up-to-date evaluation results. Make sure statements and data lead to goals. We should be able to look at those statements that have those numbers, and from those numbers, we should go over to the goals section on the IEP, and we should be able to say there's a link between those two things. The student's able to answer who, what, where, and why questions with 50% accuracy at grade level. Then we go over to the goals and we say, all right, we're going to extend that student to 75% this year. You see what I'm saying? There has to be a check and a balance there between the present level and the goal. Do not simply restate the disability, tell how it adversely affects by looking at expected similar age standards. Do not recycle IEP present levels. Current means no older than 1 year. And that also comes with the ENDREW F case. Very clear that they had the same old goals year after year. They copied and pasted, and there was not a whole lot going on with that. And the IEP wasn't really worth the paper that it was written on. What you expect a student to accomplish. in the annual goals section. The annual goals that are measurable, easy to spot if it has data and numbers, annual goals that have 6 components. In the state of Kentucky, we have the IEP guidance document. The IEP guidance document says that in order to have an annual goal that's proper and efficient, we should have an A, B, C, D, E, F component. And the A is the audience or the student, the B is the behavior, the C is the circumstance or the setting of the circumstance under which the behavior is going to be measured. And then the E is the evaluation method of measurement. That's the tool that you're going to use to measure the behavior. The E is going to measure the B. And then how often are we going to take data is the frequency. And that frequency that you state in that goal should be also matching on your chart or graph when you're doing progress monitoring. Annual goals have 3 verbs that you should have verbs that you can see, count, hear, or time. That's what makes verbs measurable. That's what makes goals measurable. Got to have those more measurable verbs. And, you know, in the IEP training, we go a little deeper and we'll even say, here's what Bloom's taxonomy says about this level of a verb and what this is going to measure and how complex it's going to get and whether or not we're really pushing that student to be ambitious. But verbs that you can see, count, hear, and time. Annual goals is an embedded tool that will measure those verbs. And then short terms we should have for significant cognitive disability. Measuring progress. This is another big piece. We've already kind of hit this, but it's important. An IEP will have a statement of how progress will be measured and how often the data will be collected. In Kentucky, this is embedded in the goal. We put the measurement tool in the goal. That's the E part of that A, B, C, D, E, F. In Kentucky, IEP must state how often parents will receive a progress report on those goals. We know that as often as we provide a report card for students without disabilities, we must provide a progress report on the annual goals for students with disabilities. By law, that report must be sent as often as report cards are sent. So instruction and services, special design instruction, teaching that aids student in progressing in curriculum and to participate in the LRE and the format, small group, whole, individual. We should know what that is. We should know specially design instruction is what that special education teacher does. It's what we do that is different for that student. Special design instruction should be provided the first time by a certified special education teacher. So if you're relying on instructional assistants to provide services, the specially designed instruction must be introduced by a certified special education teacher the first time it's introduced. And we're looking at standards there. We're covering standards, or we're working on skills, whatever it is, whatever that special design instruction is, and it's stated in the IEP. PLCs probably should focus on helping special education teachers develop skills in high leverage practices that are research-based and proven to work for students with disabilities. We talk a lot in our IEP training about the need for special education teachers to be able to have a go-to toolbox that has those tried and true specially designed instruction strategies that we can pull out for the majority of our students. We know that we're going to have kids come to us with reading difficulties. We know that we're going to have kids come to us with a reduced ability to do math, to remember steps. We have cognition issues. We have all kinds of things. So we encourage our teachers to develop their top 6 specially designed instruction activities and practices around those expected students. And then when we get to that place in the road where we don't know what's around that curve, then we can say, you know what, we can look and do some extra work and come up with strategies that are going to attack that special situation. But if we've already got a strong toolbox, we're going to hit most of the problems that we see with IEPs. Formatted services for SDI and related services that are spelled out. Supplementary aids and services are those things that students need in order to put them on a level playing field. Those are the things that students need to be successful, to make progress within the general curriculum. If you can ask yourself the question, Is this something the student needs? Then we can put that in the supplementary aids and services section of the IEP. It's hard to say. And then the accommodations inside and outside of the class and for state testing. We need to know what those are. We need to know how to apply them, whether or not they're eligible for those accommodations, and whether or not they're being given on a daily basis or at least on a routine basis, and whether or not they're included in the the lesson plans, and whether or not the students are in fact eligible. And it's when we're given accommodations, you can accommodate a lot of things in a regular classroom, in a resource room. But if you're talking about accommodations on a state test, that's a little different. And there's an inclusion document that you should be aware of on KDE's website. And you all have to be trained in that when we get ready to do testing. And so it's very important as chairpersons that we make our teachers aware of the fact that they need to be really well versed in providing those accommodations so that we do in fact assess what a student with a disability actually can do. And, accommodations don't impact or give them the answer or provide them with some kind of false score. So one of the big things we do ARC meetings is we send notices. And I really wanted to provide you with a look at what a notice kind of looks like and kind of hit the high points and also highlight some of the things where we make mistakes around documenting this notice. This notice is part of the due process law. It is something that, the parent has a right to be notified. They have the right to bring who they want. They have the right to say, no, I can't meet at that time. Could you find an alternate time for me? They have the right to participate by alternate means. So that's all kind of captured here in this form. And if you look up here at the very top, this is the date right here, right at the very top of the form where I'm hovering with my mouse. I don't know if you can see that or not, but if you can see that, you would see that that's the date that the notice is generated. Now down here at the bottom, you chairpersons, you're the one that should be right here, okay? Lots of times, Brenda and I know Brenda's listening, when we see this, we'll see things like special ed teacher in here. That's a no-no. This is the name of the district representative. Now, the district representative has responsibilities and has some authority that the special education teacher does not have. They have knowledge of the district's funds. They can make decisions, and they can make decisions that are going to spend money. So right here, this should be the name of the chairperson. In most instances, this should be the name of the chairperson or his designee, okay? So, and then your telephone number. So don't put the teacher's name right there. As you're looking at those notices, as you receive these notices, and we know that teachers fill these out for chairpersons, and that's okay, but we need to make sure that we got the right information on there. Notice at the top, you have a first notice, a second notice, and a third notice. That's also very important. When we're talking about annual reviews, if we're not getting any back and forth correspondence with parents, it's very important in several instances that meetings are held within the timeline for reporting purposes, for compliance purposes. We've just gone through a couple of caps in Knott County. One of the things that we have to make sure of is that our annual reviews are held on time. If your annual reviews are not held on time, or if your 60-day timeline is out, those are non-compliances that we get cited for. If we have more than one of those in a district, it's a systemic issue, and we get cited and we get a cap, okay? That was not the only thing that we got cited for, but that was part of it. So when you're a teacher at the high school level, part of the question of whether or not the post-secondary goal has been updated annually is in fact that meeting has been held within the timeline. So we can't have a dead IEP. So we start notifying people 21 days in advance on that first notice. If we don't receive anything back, we go to a second notice, 7 days. and we have a calendar, 7 calendar day difference between this date at the top and the date that the actual meeting is going to be held. So you see that arrow right there? You can see that those dates should be a 7 calendar day gap. And that's why we say start 21 days in advance. If we notify the parent properly 3 times, that's 21 days. And then we can go ahead and have that annual review meeting, even if the parent's not involved. That's the one time we can go ahead and have that meeting. We can have an annual review without that parent involved if we need to, if we can't get them to cooperate. So I wanted to make that, perfectly clear to you. Now over here, I've got a screenshot that is straight out of the record review. One of the things that is very key is that we get the purpose of the meeting correct. Okay, so as an ARC chairperson, we would need to make sure that we know what the meeting's about, and we know that the meeting is either going to be an annual review, that's the 3rd one down, to develop, review, and or revise the IEP and make placement decisions. To discuss a referral would be that initial meeting that we have. To discuss results of the individual evaluation and develop an IEP if eligible would be that results meeting where we would be looking at that evaluation to determine whether or not that child's eligible. And then when a student turns 13 years of age, we really start looking at to discuss post-secondary transition, and we mark that. And then we invite the student down here under these roles. Now, to have a properly constituted ARC, we need to have a chairperson, a regular ed teacher, and a special ed teacher. That's at minimum. We need to have the time in there, and we need to have the location in there. And then down here, you see a big old star, a big old gold star. If we invite outside agencies, and sometimes we'll invite Voc Rehab for transition. Sometimes we'll invite HCTC, or we'll invite a disability coordinator from Alice Lloyd, or whatever it might be. We also have the right to check not appropriate this time if we're not going to invite anyone. But if we do invite someone and we capture that other as HCTC, or we check Voc Rehab, we have to have a consent. And that consent, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later too, that consent must be done before this date up here at the top. We must have a parent give us consent, because what are we doing? We are violating FERPA by releasing registry information if we don't have that included. So we need that consent. And if we're inviting those folks multiple times, if we're having an ARC meeting at the age 16, and then we're having one at age 17, you got to get another consent if you invite them again. That same consent does not blanketly cover you. You have to get it each time. And then when that student turns 18, you need to get the student to sign off and give you consent to have those outside agencies involved, and to be able to release that information that you have a student in your building that's disabled but needs you to come to the meeting to provide some of those robust services that go into a transition plan. Okay, so keep in mind, again, make sure we're getting the name of the district right. And then down here at the bottom of this is, over here on number 7, we got the time of the meeting, the date of the meeting, the location of the meeting, and the role of the participants. Now, we're not putting any names in here. We're just inviting roles. And then an option for the parent to note the need for an alternative meeting, time, date, location, and means of participation is down here, taken care of by form. And if you notice right here, there's some wording here about if they need to reschedule, who to get in contact with, that kind of thing, that they may bring anybody or any kind of information that they want to bring, and we will consider it. We don't necessarily always have to take it for face value, but we have to consider it at least if they bring in information. And we got to give them an alternate time to meet, and that's all taken care of by form down here. And also, it's important that we, as much as possible, capture the fact that the student or the parent has received this notice. If you can get them to sign it and date it, that really helps in terms of, especially if you go into a due process situation or a complaint's filed, and they're trying to say you haven't notified them. If you can get them to sign that piece of paper, you've got your documentation. So enough about that. But that is a big part of what you do as a chairperson, is making sure this form is correct, and help your new teachers make sure it's correct. because we run into a lot of issues with compliance if we don't have this form correct. And this is part of the forms that you provide these parents. I've already kind of hit this post-secondary transition goals and services at age 14. We said age 13 because sometimes before that annual review pops up, that student will turn 14. And we don't want to get into a situation where we don't have the proper things documented for that student. We have to invite them. We have to have an ILP. We have to have a multi-year course of study based on that ILP. We have to have those results captured, and we have to invite that student. And discussion of this must be captured in the meeting. Do not let your teachers have a conference summary where they don't capture that back and forth information that has to do with a multi-year course of study for a student even 14 years of age. There should be some back and forth discussion with the parent. Hey, student's taking these courses. The ILP tells us the student wants to be a mechanic. So we've got them, we're teaching them, you know, these courses are going to be applicable for this type of post-secondary transition. And we capture that. Students should be in that meeting. To the, you know, if you don't have that student in that meeting, you have to invite them at minimum. And then you have to include their preferences and interests as you move through. So you're going to need to capture all that in your documentation. Same thing for here at 16. It gets ramped up a little bit further. This is federal law. This is state law. Beginning at age 16, a student with disabilities shall be invited to all meetings, have a multi-year course of study, and we should, as special education teachers and chairpersons, we should be talking with that student and having that back and forth. Are you matriculating? Are you moving from grade to grade? Are you taking things you need to be taking? And we should be given assessments from year to year to update that present level so that we can say, yes, that post-secondary goal has been updated annually. Have a post-secondary goal. Have present levels that identifies at least one area of need. And then we must have consent for outside agency. Send that first. And Brenda made me think about this the other day. It's so important that you send that consent for that outside agency first before you generate that notice. It needs to be dated before. If we go back to the top of that notice, our consent should be dated a day, at least a day before that notice is generated. Here's some other things in post-secondary transition goals and services at age 16. Have identified barriers in the present level performance that are informed by data from age-appropriate assessments. Those assessments need to be current. So that means giving assessments from year to year. I've provided your teachers with the documents that they need. They're right at their fingertips. It's the South Bend transition website out of South Bend, Indiana. You say, well, is that compliant Kentucky? This is a federal indicator. It is compliant. So those assessments are right at their fingertips, and they should be pulling those and updating their present levels annually. Going away from copying and pasting, identifying at least one area of need that they're going to identify barriers, and they're going to attack, and they're going to get that robust transition plan and give services. One of the other things that I may have left off this slide is that when you put those services down, one of the main services that you have to have in an IEP is that it has a multi-year course of study. So you have to list that in your transition services and what agency is responsible for providing that service. And that one would be the school in which you're working with that student. Now, here's another thing that a behavior intervention plan. We had a really, really good meeting on manifestation determination. We understand that behavior intervention plans are not always required, but it is a tool for managing a student's problematic behavior. All disability categories can have behavior goals, BIPs, and FBAs. You don't have to be EBD in order to have a functional behavioral assessment conducted or to have problematic behaviors. Federal law says that a student with a disability has the right to have positive behavior intervention supports regardless of disability category, if they have problematic behaviors. So if we have an IEP that has present levels that mention, you should be, as chairpersons, looking at that present level. And you should be seeing if there's any kind of information there that would speak to a behavior problem. You also know what your discipline referrals tell you. and you would be reviewing those. And a BIP may be based on the findings of the FBA, but a BIP could also be developed around goals. And certainly replacing negative behaviors with positive behaviors is the goal here when we're developing those BIPs. BIPs are used to help manage a student's anger, lack of impulse control, or inappropriate interaction with peers or adult authority figures. Those are important pieces of information. Those help you to gather data. There's particular data tools that go with those behavior intervention plans, and understanding those tools are key in changing that behavior. When a student's behavior impedes learning, there's a section on the IEP, it's called Special Factors. It's the second page of the IEP after present level. When a student's behavior is mentioned in the present level as being problematic to the point that it's impacting learning, we then need to place that in there, and we need to consider assessments, goals, strategies, plans of attack, take data on that problem. We need to know what works and what doesn't. By law, a student with a disability is afforded positive behavior intervention supports. BIPs should describe the behavior specifically. BIPs should tell what is causing the behavior. Access that FBA if you have one. Find out what the function of that behavior is. What are they getting out of it? What's the consequences? Are we causing that behavior to occur more by the consequences we give them? Sometimes, you know, when we suspend a kid and send them home, that's exactly what they want. So we got to be careful about that. PBIS includes strategies and supports and explanation of how to respond to a student who engages in a target behavior. When should we conduct an FBA? We've talked about this in our MDR training. When a student is suspended and a change of placement is expected, we should be looking to see if there's an FBA. Now, if there's an FBA that's already been done, all we have to do is circle back and review that FBA and see if it's appropriate. And then we would look at that behavior intervention plan and tweak it and really make some decisions in the ARC meeting. But it's a best practice to conduct one when a student's behavior is not understood. So keep that in mind. Now, setting up the ARC meeting, kind of getting into the chairperson part here. Get appropriate staff to the ARC meeting. Mutually convenient time and place is important. You know that the parent has the right to refuse to meet at a certain time. So make sure that you're working with parents, that you're not denying them that right. Make sure the ARC notice is sent appropriately, that it's sent out well in advance so that you have time to adjust. Send meeting notices to parents in a timely manner. Ensure or assure documentation of attempts to schedule ARC meetings are placed in the student's folder. Keep up with that documentation. Begin 21 days in advance. That's a best practice. There's nothing in law that says you have to do that, but it certainly makes sense to me that if you've got 7 calendar days between the time that you can schedule that meeting and not schedule that meeting, and we're going to look at the notice in depth again here in just a second, and we'll show you, an exception to that rule. But making sure that IEPs are updated annually in timelines is certainly something that ARC chairpersons should take a more active role in my mind. Okay, there's the notice again. And that's a little bit closer view of that, but I just want to make sure that we understand the purposes, we understand the dates, we understand the notice, the second notice and the third notice and what that means, and that we have a properly constituted ARC, making sure that the chairperson's there, the regular ed teacher's there, and the special ed teacher's there. Those folks cannot be dismissed, okay? They have to be there. Now, let's say you run into a problem. You got a regular ed teacher that calls in sick. You've got a scheduled ARC. You're inviting a roll. So get another regular ed teacher that's similar age and that can speak to the standards, okay? So just keep that in mind. I'm going to skip over that and come to this. The local education agency provides a written invitation to the parent at least, look at this. This comes straight out of the record review, 7 calendar days before an ARC meeting. All right, so that's the date here and the date here. So the date at the top should be 7 calendar days from the date here. We should also always, when the student is 13 and above, invite the student, okay? Always have a properly constituted ARC by having these three people right here at the top: chairperson, regular ed, special ed. Make sure we get the name appropriately. If we've invited any of these agencies, make sure that we've got the consent to do so from the parent, and it's dated well before we've generated this notice. Okay, now here's the exception. I put it down here. On your notice, these screenshots didn't have this, so I added this. If the parent agrees to meet prior to the 7 calendar days, you can mark this as an NA. Note here that when we look at your notice of ARC, and we look at your contact log, and we look at your conference summary report, we can see if the parent requested or agreed to meet earlier. That should be documented. You can mark that on there, and that alleviates you of that 7 calendar days. So you can have a meeting sooner than 7 days if the parent agrees. Or if the meeting is for a safety issue or a change in placement due to a violation of a student code of conduct, that requires a 24-hour notice. So those are the times when that exception would come into play. And again, I've just got that up there for you to see it a little easier. The exception is on that 7 days. We talked about a mutually agreed upon time and place. And this is part of the record review document as well. No documentation of multiple attempts. You would get a no here. So if you sent one notice and you didn't get anything back from the parent, and then you went out of timeline, and you didn't do your second notice and your third notice, and you didn't document your attempts to contact them, you didn't call them on the telephone, you didn't document copies of correspondence sent to the parents or detailed records of visits or home visits or visits to the place of employment, those types of things. This is obviously things that we consider in non-pandemic times. So we're doing everything we can to get those people to the table, and we're documenting a mutually agreed upon time and place, and we're capturing the location. Okay. And so I just wanted to throw that in there as far as notice. Parent notice of meeting, some things to know. Those with the legal right to make idea education decisions for students must receive the notice of ARC. Now, this gets into the law a little bit, and this is some of the things that you probably want to know. If the students are being represented by someone other than their biological parents, but the biological parents' rights have not been terminated, they have the right to be invited. They don't have to come, but they have the right to be invited. It's a FAPE violation. This is per Teresa Combs, to not invite them to the students' ARC meeting. So if you have a biological parent that's hanging out there that still has rights, they should be at least invited. If you have a parent that's incarcerated, they have the right to be invited and included in the meeting. They have the right to attend. They don't have to, but they have the right to be invited. This is governed under IDEA and state law. Who has the legal right to sign consent for evaluation, placement, and reevaluation? It is a FAPE violation not to get the required IDEA consents from the appropriate parent or legal guardian. Biological parents, surrogate parents, court-ordered guardians, foster parents if a court has terminated parent rights, or if a biological parent has granted the authority to make such decisions in writing to a foster parent. An individual ordered by an appropriate court to make such decisions, or a Kentucky court-ordered permanent guardian. Out-of-state orders concerning such issues should be reviewed by an attorney. So if you get those out-of-state orders, you got to run that by your attorney. Get your board attorney involved. Okay. Questions about that? Again, continuing. Who has the legal right to sign consent for evaluation, placement, and reevaluation? This is continuing. A person acting as a parent. That is not recommended. This is not recommended unless parent with rights sign something granting this right. Now, a couple of years back, we had an issue with this, and we always make it a best practice to have it notarized. Make sure the notary is, in fact, that their commission has not expired. So that's that's a no-no. Be on the lookout for that. So a person acting as a parent, in loco parentis, I think is the Latin phrase, we wouldn't recommend using that unless the parents have given you something in writing. Kentucky court order permanent custodian can be treated like a guardian. It's cleaner if the court orders the biological parents will never again get custody of the child. You know, but if you have a court-ordered permanent custodian, you know, there's probably some training that needs to happen, and you know, around that surrogate type situation there. The U.S. Department of Education's Office of Special Education Programs says you cannot utilize a surrogate parent just because parents or guardians do not want to attend meetings. So, you know, Knott County Board of Education keeps a couple surrogate parents trained up. They're not employees of the school district. There's not supposed to be any kind of, you know, conflict of interest with this person, but you can't just go to that surrogate because the other parents won't, you know, play ball with you. You need to try to get them to play ball as much as possible. Parents only have to be provided the opportunity to attend, says Teresa Combs. Now, this is another important form. Notice right at the top what's required. Hopefully you can see that's a little fuzzy, but I'm going to read it to you. This is a determination of education representative. This needs to be filled out at the time of referral. And there's some instances where you got special situations. You need to read this in its entirety. Complete this form at the time of referral for a student who is suspected of needing special ed services and at the time of enrollment for a student who is transferring into the district and receiving special education services from another district. So 2 instances when you need to fill this out. You do not need to fill this out from year to year for a student that stays in your program from grade 3 to 12. You need to have this one time, and then if the circumstances change, you would need to determine who the educational rep is. So you need to be on your toes when it comes to this, or as Anita Archer says, you need to be on your toes when it comes to educational rep. You know, you need to determine who's representing this student and if they are, in fact, the proper person to do so. So the ARC meeting and documentation. It's the district's meeting. You have the right to stop it, pause it, reconvene it, get more data. That's always a good reason for stopping. If you come to an impasse in a meeting and you are the chair, you're in control of the meeting, you want to stick to that purpose. You know, we stated in the notice, I'm going to make you sick here for a second. We stated in the notice here what the purpose of the meeting is. Stick to those purposes. Now, if the parent brings something up that's worthy of discussion, you document that as other discussion, but you stick to the purpose and you run your meeting. It is your meeting. It's a FAPE violation not to invite the student's appropriate legal representative to ARC meetings. We know that. This is governed by IDEA state law. And it would help if I would get back to the right slide. The district controls the paperwork. It's your all's paperwork. You decide what goes in that paperwork, but you've got to document everything that's supposed to be documented. Documentation is evidence should ARC decisions be challenged. So you need to be capturing everything that needs to be captured. It's a good practice to have a couple of special ed teachers in that meeting if you can. I know that doesn't always work out for folks who don't have coverage and don't have people that are able to go into these classes and things of that nature. And I know it's a logistical issue, but someone needs to be capturing what's being said. And it's never a problem until it's a problem. In running the meeting, verify the parent has parent rights statements and indicate he or she understands it. Use the appropriate forms, cover the required topics. Assure all proposals are discussed by the ARC team. Assure decisions are documented, and assure that it's documented that decisions are based on data. That will get you in the clear with a court of law if you're basing your information and your decisions on clearly defined sets of data. Okay, so it's important that you progress monitor. It's important that you have data based on your eligibility decisions. or to base your eligibility decisions on. So important. Running the meeting. It's helpful to assign a meeting recorder who's knowledgeable about the special education process and forms. Provide procedural safeguards. This is another big part of the meeting. This is the notice to parents of their rights. You're supposed to go over those rights. You're supposed to ensure that you've talked in layman's terms so that they can understand those rights. It's a good idea to ask them that straight up question. Do you understand the rights that you have been afforded here? Do you need us to go over them again? You're supposed to, by law, give them the rights each year in its entirety. 32 pages, I think it is, or 33 pages that the parent rights are. And there's copies of that. You have copies of that at your school, so you should be giving those to the parents. They don't have the right to refuse that on that one time. My lights went out. Sorry about that. Provide a copy of the ARC documentation to the parent. Make sure that they get all due process forms. Now, we have, in COVID times, we're meeting alternatively, all right? We're meeting in an alternate means. If we do that, there's a place on the signature page of the conference summary, and I probably should have a screenshot here, and I might have one later, that shows you what you're supposed to fill out. You check that box, alternate means. You may even get that signature later. Your district may require you to get that signature later. But there's two things on there in the record review that's required when you do an alternate meeting, and the person is not physically in the building with you. You have to send the documentation, the due process forms, to the parent, and you got to date it, and you tell the process by which you sent it. So that's very important that that's captured in order to fulfill the due process law that we are supposed to be fulfilling for our parents. Concluding the meeting. If a parent disagrees with an ARC decision, explain how a parent may access mediation and file a complaint or due process hearing, and capture all that documentation. Get signatures of those attending. Assure appropriate paperwork is provided to the parent after the meeting. And if a parent is not at the ARC meeting, make sure that you mail it to the parent after each meeting. Make sure they get it somehow. And then capture how you did it and what date you did it on. And then if there are additional procedures, you can look in your LEA'S local policies and procedures for procedural safeguards and state complaint procedures. If you need to go into that for a parent, you may want to have that handy so that you can tell them exactly what their rights are in regards to reaching out for mediation. And I would encourage you to, I've not been through many of those. I've had some complaints as a director when I was serving as a director, and I had some caps, but I didn't have I didn't have any due process hearings. But one of the things that you'll want to do is, if you do have a disagreement, you would try to work that out with the parent. And it's never good to be deciding something on principle, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it's certainly a place where you would want to capture what's being said, and try to encourage them, if you can't get them to come to some type of agreement, to first seek mediation. That's much better than going to due process. So we're going to pause right there. I'm going to stop my share for a second, and I'm going to pause the recording. Start recording again and share the screen again. I put in the chat for you that are interested the code that will take you to the Google Classroom, where there's some documents posted, some things that you could just refer to if need be in regards to your responsibilities and roles as a chairperson, and then those continuum of placement options. And I think there's one other piece of information, and we'll continue to add to that and make information available to you as we move through the school year. So we left off on concluding the meeting. I want to go back and hit how important it is that we capture how we get the documentation to the parent. and we make sure that we keep a good account of that. Now, we're going into the particular kinds of meetings that we have, and here is one that we have, the referral meeting. In a referral meeting, one of the main things that we do is look at the data. We look at what the response to intervention data says. We try to discuss how we would rule out the lack of instruction in reading, math, or limited English proficiency as a cause of student performance deficit. You know, you're by law, you're supposed to have proper instruction. And if you have not had proper instruction for things like lack of attendance or moving around to several different schools or things of that nature, that would be an exclusionary rule on some of our criteria for, especially for if finding a student with a disability and specific learning disability. So very, very important that we look at that RTI data. We look at whether or not the student has had the proper instruction before moving forward. Then we decide in the referral meeting what we're going to evaluate, or if we're going to evaluate, or if there's enough suspecting information that's going to determine that we need to evaluate. We can also have that meeting and say, you know what, we need more data. We talked about that a little bit earlier. If you don't feel like that the RTI data is sufficient to, you know, the student should be having repeated assessments, having moved through the tiers, and then at tier 3, after repeated assessments with fidelity, not made any progress. Now, I will say this. Some of our districts have gotten themselves into trouble by looking at that data just lightly and going ahead and finding the student eligible, and then, you know, using that as a vehicle for accommodation. And, you know, we don't want to do that just so you can have accommodations on the test. One of the other things that we face sometimes as districts is this thing called over-identification. And when we over-identify, we fall into a category whereby we may face some rule of law from the state that would say that we are a CCEIS district, and that we would then need to take 15% of our budget that might provide some services for students and spend 15% of our special education budget to really review our RTI practices, to really review why we're over-identifying students. And, you know, we're in fact dealing with that right now. So I caution you, I urge you to be a gatekeeper, to make sure that you've got the proper data, that the student in fact needs special design instruction, that they meet the criteria for eligibility, and that we don't just flippantly place them based on some really bad data or no data, and that business as usual is not acceptable. You know, it is very, very important that we are vigilant about making sure that we're accepting referrals that have the proper instruction provided for the student, and that RTI has been conducted and the student's essentially making no progress in tier 3. Other things we do in the referral meetings, once we decide to go ahead and evaluate, we provide documentation of the decision to evaluate or not to evaluate to the parents. So that either way, you're going to provide that documentation and give reasons. We can also ask for more data, and remember to get parent consent for initial evaluation. You can't do the IQ test. You can't do the Wyatt, the adaptive behavior, the behavioral observations, formal observations without consent from the parent. An evaluation planning meeting. This is the meeting, you know, going back to, if you can visualize The notice, this is like the second purpose down on your notice of ARC. This is where your, I'm sorry, this would be in with your referral meeting maybe. This would be your first choice on your purposes. So you would discuss RTI data, discuss areas of weakness for the child, discuss areas to evaluate, and fill out that evaluation planning form as need be. Keep in mind, child find and evaluation and reevaluation rule of law is in place there in your local education agency's policies and procedures. And make sure you document the discussion of what you're deciding to evaluate. Now, if you suspect an area, you're bound by law to evaluate it. Okay, so if you have the student, you've identified an area of weakness or an area of need, is a better way of putting that, then you would need to effectively evaluate that. So you evaluate, the law says you evaluate all areas of suspected disability. Now, in the eligibility meeting, this would be the second one down. I got ahead of myself a little bit. Provide a copy of the evaluation report to parents at least by the time the ARC convenes. It's a good idea, a good practice, if you get that psychological back, to go ahead and send that to the parent and let them have time to digest that information, particularly if it's going to be an emotionally charged diagnosis or eligibility meeting. Give them an opportunity to at least have 24 hours to kind of, you know, take that information in and really process that information. Document the RTI data was provided to the parents during the RTI process. That's a piece on the record review. Discuss the RTI data. You should definitively have RTI data with repeated assessments given by the appropriate people and be able to say that the child did not make progress, they've been properly instructed, and we still feel like there's problems. Provide documentation of determination of eligibility or non-eligibility to the parents. There's an eligibility form that you fill out. Use the eligibility definitions in your district's policies and procedures, and apply criteria in the district special education procedures. Provide a copy of the eligibility determination to the parents. Also, make sure that we're putting a copy in with the conference summary or in the due process folder. It's a good idea to just attach it to that conference summary so that when we go to looking for it, we can find it. Okay, because that's part of what we do when we do record reviews. And, you know, we're going to be doing some record reviews right on throughout this year. We still got some things to do with CAP 4 on our indicator 4 CAP. And so we're going to be looking at files, and we're going to be continuing to review your files and doing some random audits to keep everyone on their toes and to make sure that we're documenting appropriately. So one of those pieces is making sure that we got an eligibility form for every eligibility for every student that we find eligible for our programs. Those forms are readily available on KDE's website. And they're also in Infinite Campus. So IEP development placement setting, discuss all IEP components in the district special education procedures. You know, look at the subsections in your local policies and procedures on the contents of the IEP. We've kind of already hit this. We know that IEP services must be determined prior to determining the placement. For older students, we got to discuss transition, provide an IEP copy to the parents, and remember, the ARC determines any variation to the student's school day. Get consent when you need to get consent. We've talked about some times when we need to get consent. Before evaluation, before they have services the first time, we would need to get consent. We would also need to get consent before we invite any outside agencies or we release any personally identifiable information. If we're going to use the student's likeness in any type of media, we would need consent. So there's always times that we need to be thinking about making sure we've got consent to do what we're doing with students with disabilities. There's a high level of potential for litigation around that. So make sure that you're doing what you need to be doing and you're vigilant in the area of consent and parent consent. The ARC documents parent refusal to or revocation of consent. Now, if you're doing some services with the student, you found them eligible, and then the parent decides they don't want to provide you with consent to do that anymore, or they want to refuse services, nothing's retroactive. So, anything you do up to that point is not going to be reviewed or reviewable by law just because the parent decides all of a sudden they're mad at you and they don't want the student to be in special education. So keep that in mind. Get consent when you need to get consent and have that captured and documented. ARC documents staff member attempts to convince parents to accept or continue IDEA services. If a parent comes into you and says, I no longer want IDEA services, have a discussion, captured in the conference summary, that it's the local education agency's position that this is not the best thing for the student. Annual review meetings. Discuss present levels, discuss progress data, look at your policies and procedures around what's required for an annual review meeting, consider or determine when to consider ESY services, when appropriate, determine timeline for reevaluation. Now, around ESY services, there's some information that we'll go over in just a little bit, so I'll come back to that. Reevaluation meetings, look at your policy and procedures for reevaluation, child find and evaluation, follow appropriate district timelines. Now, we know reevaluations must occur every 3 years. Determine what areas to reevaluate, give parents notice of areas to reevaluate, and get consent to perform formal evaluations. Provide for full reassessment if requested by parents. If a parent comes in and says, I don't want a review of records, I want an IQ test repeated, then you must do it. Okay? Set another meeting to review results for any new evaluations and provide a copy of the ARC decision regarding continued eligibility. We've really hit hard the manifestation determination review. I'm going to go over this really quickly. Follow the 7-day or 24-hour written notice to parent as required by law. Utilize timelines and district special education procedures. Make sure that you know what those are. Meet with the staff to have a proposal for a new placement to offer parents at ARC meeting before conducting a manifestation determination review. The final decision on placement must be made at the ARC meeting. If ARC and parents agree to a placement change, do not have to conduct a manifestation determination. That's important to remember. And also remember that if you're going to change the placement and you come to that point in the road where you're going to change that placement, they're at the 11th day removal, you've got to notify that parent within 24 hours, and then you've got to have that meeting within 10 days. So keep those things, but those are all included in your local policies and procedures. Plan an FBA or review behavioral goals. We've talked on this quite a bit. I think you understand that we need to not get caught with our pants down on this issue, okay? If a student is causing problems, if they got behavior issues, we need to revisit the ARC. We need to conduct another ARC and change that plan. In the interim, in those baby steps, if the kid's giving you some grief, you need to think, he's got an IEP. Should we review the ARC? Or should we review the IEP through an ARC meeting? And the answer most of the time is yes, because this potential for them to move to greater problems exists. And especially if we see a pattern occurring. If there's a series of removals around a particular type of behavior, we need to make sure that we're vigilant and we're keeping a close watch on that one. Now, when we go back to regular in-person school, and we will, one of these days we're going to do that, and you're getting discipline referrals, you need to be keeping up with that monthly and filling out that form and making sure that we're documenting, and that is part of our indicator 4 CAP activity. So you need to be aware of that spreadsheet, and you need to be thinking about that spreadsheet as we move through. An ARC to consider placement in an interim alternative educational setting, an IES. This meeting may be needed if a parent requests a due process hearing and district officials have determined it's unsafe to leave a student in a stay put setting until the hearing officer decision is made. It can be used only when certain weapons, drugs, or serious bodily injury offenses have occurred. we can impose a 45-day interim alternative educational setting placement, even if the misbehavior is a manifestation of the disability. In other words, the disability caused the behavior to occur. We can still put them in a 45-day interim setting and conduct a manifestation determination only, when we do that 11th day removal. But we can impose 45 days, even if that misbehavior is deemed a manifestation. We can still, with those weapons, drugs, and serious bodily injury, we can put them in that interim alternative setting. ARC, prior to asking a judge or hearing officer for a placement. This meeting may be needed if a parent requests a due process hearing. District officials have determined leaving a child in a current placement is likely to result in physical harm to a child or others based on data. Okay? Attempt to get the parent agreement to a proposed placement change before applying to a judge or a hearing officer to impose an IES. Talk to those parents. Get them to agree to it. And you can request IES placement even if the misbehavior is a manifestation. ARC to determine continued services during expulsion. An IES or suspension that constitutes a placement change. ID students must receive general ed and special educational services during any time period of removal from school past 10 days. Remember, you got 10 free days, and that once you hit that 11th day, you still have to provide services. Determine what services student need for FAPE to access and progress. RC decides how much time each week is needed based upon individual needs of a student and the setting, the student-teacher ratio, and functioning level of the student. So, to provide that's still a committee decision as to how much, is appropriate to provide FAPE to allow for access to the general curriculum and progress within that curriculum. You also have a service plan. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but if a student is on a private service plan, you would need to review that as well. If the student is not your resident student and you don't have to complete an IEP, you just have to provide a service plan, that's something that you might be posed with. And if you do have that come up, I would say contact one of us, either Jonathan, myself, or Brenda, and let us help you with that. Let us get you the answers that you need. For a unilaterally enrolled private school student, we don't provide IEP services, but we do have a service plan that you need to fill out. And the district has pre-decided what services those are going to be and what that's going to look like. Lots of times that just falls into providing speech for your privately placed students. And that does include your homeschool students. So keep that in mind. So you say, well, we don't have any private schools over here in Knott County. Well, yeah, you do. If a student is on homeschool, that's an individual private school. So if there's need for speech, then you would have a service plan in place. Some additional responsibilities: review your policies and procedures, provide information to parents about individual education evaluation criteria. If you have an evaluation done and the parent comes in and says, we disagree with the findings of this, they have the right to request an IEE, which is an individual education evaluation, one time per evaluation. And so then it would be the district's responsibility to pay for that and have that parent, sent somewhere to have an evaluation. The district retains the right to choose where that evaluation occurs, but that would be certainly something that we would need to talk about, and you would want to get Jonathan involved in that decision-making process. Search district special education procedures for ARC chair, district representative, or LAA representative for additional responsibilities such as informing implementers of responsibilities and implementing the IEP, gathering and reporting progress, and sending to parents, assisting with completion of referral, keeping required documentation, notifying parent and student a transfer of rights at age 18. Now, there's a place on the IEP for you high school principals where you need to notify that student at least 1 year in advance when those rights are going to be transferred when they're going to become an emancipated youth. Parent participation is required with FAPE. We've already hit that pretty hard. I'm going to skip over that. We know what the required ARC team members are. Opportunity for parents, and any one parent wants to bring, so they can allow that. At least one regular ed teacher of the child, or one who teaches students of that age. At least one of the child's special education teachers, or a special education teacher knowledgeable of the child's suspected disability. An LA representative, an ARC chair, and that's what I was talking about when we fill out that notice. That's the person that needs to be in there. They're qualified to teach or supervise the provision of special education. They're knowledgeable about the general curriculum and the availability of district resources. One member who can interpret the instructional implications of evaluation results. And those persons can wear multiple hats. According to the regs there, even a regular ed teacher can review those results. But most of the time, that's a special ed teacher going over those results, or maybe a school psychologist. And a chairperson could certainly fill that role as well. A child who's in the 8th grade or 14 must be invited. If you don't invite, you must gather the child's input about transitional preferences and interests. Now, we want to make you aware that you need to be monitoring what is in present levels, because that's going to be the new monitoring focus from KDE. Okay, and I don't want to say a whole lot about that, but I've already gone into detail about what present levels should have. Numbers, measurable, quantifiable data, statements that make sense, that are specific to the student's skill deficits, their recent test scores, baseline, and how the disability adversely affects their performance. So certainly those are things that you want to keep in mind as we move forward. When we design the IEP program, we need to make sure that's tailored to the specific needs of the student and based on current data. Now, we know that the Raleigh case said that personalized instruction with sufficient services to permit the child to benefit educationally is what that said. But then we're operating under the ENDREW law, and it goes a lot deeper. And it also says that we must write those goals, ambitious goals for that student in light of their unique circumstances. And it goes far beyond what was found in the Raleigh case. The student must have been planned for. How much progress is planned for? Meaningful education benefit is gauged in relation to the potential of the child at issue. Now that's an old case, or a fairly old case, 16 years. That's Deal versus Hamilton Board of Education. That did happen in the 6th Circuit, where we actually are governed by the courts of appeal. And I think that was a case up in Cincinnati. So, you know, when we're talking about meaningful education benefit, we need to reasonably calculate the IEP, implement the IEP, make sure that we got ambitious goals, update the IEP over each year, and make sure that the present levels speak to what they need to speak to, and that the goals are measurable, and that we're progress monitoring those goals. So that's all I'm going to say about that in terms of what the Raleigh standard was, what Deal said, and what's required. Again, ENDREW, if I had more time, and I'm running short of time, we're just about finished here. We'll be at the top of the hour. we went into the particulars of ENDREW, and we know enough about that now to speak intelligently about it, hopefully. And hopefully I've done a good job of capturing that for you. And that you know that ENDREW just speaks to FAPE. It speaks to a reasonably calculated IEP, which means that ARC meetings are for reasonably calculating what a student needs. And we do that in light of their unique circumstances, what they need, that their goals are particular to them, and that they're ambitious in light of their circumstances. How much progress can they make? What's their rate of learning? What is it they're going to be able to do in a year? Those are the kinds of considerations that we have to take into consideration when we're talking about providing a free, appropriate public education. I've already kind of talked about all of this stuff, so I'm going to jump through that. Just keep in mind that behavior goals, no matter the disability level, are allowed. One of the big themes, I would say, one of the big takeaways would be that if an IEP needs to be changed, we need to go back to the ARC meeting. No matter how painful that is, no matter how much problem we feel like that's going to cause, if a parent's not getting what they deserve in terms of an IEP, or the student's not getting an implementation, and they're not making progress, then if they take us to the courts and we haven't reestablished some things, we haven't tweaked some things, we haven't revised the IEP when we needed to, then we're in trouble. We must consider the child's needs and accommodations to participate in district extracurricular activities. We must consider whether a child needs extended school year. And there's some rules around extended school year that we may talk about here in a minute if we have time. Staffs must make good faith effort to implement the IEP. IEP service providers must have access to the IEPs, and the parents' attorneys may request staff attendance records and Medicaid logs to establish that the IEP was not implemented. So keep that in mind. Document implementation. If we had a lot of time, if this was a 6-hour training, I could go into inappropriate settings and what was found in this case here. Meaningful progress. That's a big part of FAPE. And being able to capture the data around progress is so important to say that we've done what we said we were going to do. Never discuss the cost issue. Never discuss money at an ARC meeting. Don't have to provide the best or the most expensive according to the encapsulating law of Raleigh and also the ENDREW law, but we do have to provide an ambitious, reasonably calculated IEP and then implement it and progress monitor it. Cost issue came up in the deal case, and it really was one of the telltale problems that they had and went a long way. And we can't predetermine what a student needs. We need to make sure that we're making those decisions in the ARC process. Here's one, Owensboro Public Schools. If we allow a student to enroll in your district, you owe FAPE for that year. The only legal way to send a student out of your district during that year is through proper expulsion. So make sure that we're not just trying to get rid of a student because they have challenging behaviors or we're denying them the right to attend our school district. You know, once if you allow a student to enroll, you owe them FAPE for that year. IDEA funding is tied to eligibility. We must document evidence of RTI. We must use data for decision making, have sufficient and accurate data to make the decisions. I'm going to skip on through some of this about RTI. I think we know that RTI must be done with fidelity. We must have enough water under the bridge to say that we've allowed for enough data points to say whether or not the child's making progress. We can see a trend. And then the failure to implement, here's a letter to Fox in 1978 where a district failed to implement the IEP. There are some things around ESY. The child is entitled to ESY if it would not be merely beneficial. So the whole thing about ESY is that ESY would be appropriate if it would prevent significant regression. Now, if a student's out of school for the summer or whatever, they come back, you should take data before they leave, take data when they get back, and we have about a 6-week window where we allow them to recoup what they've lost. If they don't recoup it, then ESY candidate. We can't predetermine that they're an ESY candidate just based on the fact that they're in a low incidence situation or that they have severe disabilities. We just say all severe disabilities get ESY. We can't predetermine it. It has to be based on data and need. And that's what that talks about there. And then we talk about bullying here. There's a colleague letter here. I'll make this PowerPoint available to you if you want to review some of this stuff. I'm wanting to get to some of the other information. Look at this one bullet right here. when we're considering whether or not bullying is having an impact, is there a sudden decline in grades? Is there an onset of emotional outburst, an increase of intensity of behavioral interruptions? We need to do our homework around this situation and make sure that our students with disabilities are not being bullied. And I know you guys are well versed in that. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but that is a big issue, and it's certainly one that can land you in court if you're not vigilant. I really wanted to get to these ARC tips. We've got about 20 minutes till we're going to sign off on this 3-hour training. So I really wanted to, have you perk your ears up around this. Read the latest conference summary. It's so important that you be the professional in the room. It's your meeting. You're driving the meeting. You're there. Meet before the ARC with staff as needed. Review the latest conference summary. Know what's coming. Know if it's going to be a difficult meeting. Know your parents. Make sure the parent understands and it's documented that the final decisions are made in the ARC meeting. Think real hard about special education requirements before you speak. It's your meeting, and the chair is the district's representative. So know your stuff around this. Make sure that you have done your homework before you go into that meeting. You don't want to ever put out that information or put out that perspective that that you don't know what's going on in this child's life. First of all, we have an ethical responsibility to do that, and then second of all, we want to protect the district by our representation. We have an ethical responsibility to that student to make sure that we're doing what's right for that student. But then we also have a responsibility as a representative of the district to make sure that we're compliant. And so we have to know our stuff. And reviewing the previous IEP and the conference summary and knowing what that student needs is certainly an important piece. Have an agenda and stick to it. Stay focused on the student's future educational program. Don't allow the student or don't allow that meeting to go into a rabbit hole where, if you got divorced parents, the parents get into a discussion and they try to involve people and try to get people on their side and that kind of thing. Make sure to maintain control of the meeting. Adjourn if necessary. Don't let much time pass before you reschedule though. So if you have to stop this meeting because there is a disagreement or you need more data, stop the meeting, but then get back to that meeting as soon as you get the data that you need. Make every attempt to involve the parent in the discussions, even if an advocate or a parent attorney is present. Attorney has no power over you or your staff. They are there to legally represent the parent, and they can be there. And so just keep that in mind. And also keep in mind that if they come in with their attorney, there's some new information from Teresa Combs that says that we may need to go ahead and have that meeting in spite of the fact that we've not been able to get our attorney to attend. So that's a little bit different. In the old days, when Brenda and I first became directors, if an attorney showed up, we had the right to postpone. And I think that's changed a little bit in the law. So if that happens, you've got my information, and you can get up with me or you can get up with Brenda, and certainly make sure that you are well aware of that. Make sure that make all decisions regarding the educational program placement in an ARC meeting. If parents disagree, sum up what the professionals on the team agreed is needed. The chair uses the data to make a decision the staff cannot agree on. Get more data when needed. That's Teresa Combs. This is straight out Teresa Combs stuff. Get more data. You can always use that as an excuse to stop the meeting. Okay? There's nothing professionally wrong with doing that. Have someone at the meeting who has good rapport with the parents. You need a trust level. You need to work at that trust level. Think of yourself as if you had a student with disability. Have some empathy. Take into consideration this is difficult for parents. And those difficulties probably don't ever go away in lots of cases. Discuss progress data in ARC meetings and document that the parent has received progress reports. If progress is not made, consider changing the IEP. We've talked about that a lot. Don't discuss cost. Do not set identical goals year after year. If you need to keep a goal basically the same, then document why the goal is the same.
I've lost my mind.
Again, goals should be realistic based on your data about the student's functioning level and other issues. Do not set many goals and services in the IEP that in reality cannot be implemented. Don't promise a bunch of stuff that you can't deliver on. Consider what you feel like you can get done based on the child's rate of learning, the data, what you know about the child from previous IEPs, and decide to do what you feel like you can do in a year's time. Very, very important. I apologize, just one second here. Do not add services to the IEP just to please the parent or a staff member if they are not needed for FAPE. You're in control, okay? Keep in mind, if you got data to support your decisions, you may have to disagree from time to time with the parent. And if you get into those disagreement situations and you need further assistance, always reach out to your director of special ed, reach out to your folks at the co-op who are readily available and willing to help you. Always document that you offered further meetings to try to work out the disagreement if the parent is headed for due process. If they will not agree with you, try to use mediation first. That's so important, and Teresa talks about that a lot. Train your staff in mediation techniques. Make it clear to the staff that they are not to get adversarial. Okay? You know, lots of times there's disagreements between parents and teachers. Don't allow your ARC meeting to become that, and protect your staff in regards to that. But along those same lines, don't let a staff member get out of line and cause you some problems that you can't get out of because you do not want to go to due process if you can help it. Make sure staff understand it's a legal mandate to implement the IEP. Don't allow staff members to bring union or other representatives with them to ARC meetings. The meetings are not about them. They're about the student. I would always say in my ARC meetings, we're going to place your student right out here in the middle of the table. This is what the meeting's about. And anything else is uncivilized. I think that was a commercial at one time. But honestly, anything else shouldn't be part of an ARC meeting. Don't take parents' complaints personally, but don't let them get ugly with the staff either. And that's per Teresa Combs. That's not my words. But I firmly agree with that and believe in that. More tips. Got a lot of tips. Document everything discovered. If a parent concern has been discussed, decided upon, and documented by the school team, you can move on. Call another ARC if new information is provided by the parent that may affect the child's needs. Don't go to due process or appeal out of principle or stubbornness. Don't give up and ask a hearing officer to make your decisions because the parent's difficult to deal with. It's too expensive to do that. It's your responsibility to try to see this through. It's not the hearing officer's job. You may not like the outcome if you go to due process. You may have done other things wrong that will surface during these proceedings too. So you don't want to expose yourself, okay? So try to stay away from due process if you can at all possible do that. Now I know sometimes that can't be done, and we have procedures in place to protect you and to work with you in regards to that. Consider whether you're willing to chance reversal on what you won at the lower level. Educate your board and superintendent on the up and down sides of an appeal. Don't be afraid to admit mistakes to your superintendent and board to save bigger problems, but show what you're doing to correct the situation. Consider the financial consequences. Know what you're risking by going to due process. You feel like there's no other way, just make sure you're sure about what you want to do here. What's the district's self-insured retention? Do you know what liabilities may lurk in the file? Do you know what your staff will say under oath? Don't fight a losing battle. These are all tips from Teresa Combs. Now, here's some things not to say or do. Your site-based decision-making council has proposed block scheduling to you. You have a lot of kids with IEPs in your building. Do you need to take an action regarding IEP students prior to agreeing with a site-based decision-making council to implement block scheduling? No. Special education has nothing to do with site-based decision-making. It would be smart to talk with your district special education director when it comes down to these issues. Here's another scenario, what not to say and do. You already have block scheduling in your school. Oh, that's the same one. I've left that one in there, I'm sorry. Parent of a special education student asked for an ARC meeting in order to discuss the fact that her child has not been allowed to go on a field trip for the past 2 years. The child has been in your school for this period of time. What is an appropriate response? Set up an ARC. Tell the parent that this is not an ARC issue, but a disciplinary issue. Okay, so that's what Teresa Combs says to do if you have that occur. But you need to set up an ARC and then discuss it and hash it out through the ARC process. You have an alternative program within your school. It's currently staffed with a regular ed teacher, and no special ed students have either applied or been assigned to the alternative program. A parent or one of your special education students calls you and requests to find out how she can get her child into that program, or because some of her friends' children are in the program and she feels it would be a good fit for her child. What's an appropriate response? That program's not set up for special education students. We have a process for that, and because your child is in special education, we will need to set up an ARC meeting. I will get back to you in a short period of time. Which one was more appropriate there? We have a process for that bottom one. It's probably not appropriate to say that program is not set up for special education students, right? So just keep that in mind. Some of this is common sense. Some of it is stuff that, we may not have thought about. So we bring these scenarios into your mindset here just a little bit in front of you. During an ARC in which you attend, one of your teachers makes a remark that rather than the student being in public school, he needs to be in juvenile detention. Student's not in the juvenile court system. What do? You say we need to get back to discussing the education program student. Later, have a talk with the teacher about staying focused on the student's IEP program in an ARC meeting. So you won't want your teacher to do that. Say to the teacher, tell us more. You don't want to say to the teacher, tell us more. You want to do the first one there and make sure that you are prepared to take that teacher to task in regards to that type of behavior. A parent of one of your special education students constantly emails your staff, and you and your staff is starting to feel harassed. The parent does not threaten anyone, but generally is demanding way too much of your staff's attention over issues you feel are frivolous. The parent then complains to KDE of something that occurred at school. KDE contacts you, you send an email back to KDE representative saying, first of all, I must tell you this parent is crazy. Is that a problem? It's probably not what you want to do. What is KDE going to do with that information? Do they have to turn that email over to the parent if the parent requested? Those emails are public record. So you don't want to say things like that in email. The idea here is to keep your correspondence clean, to the point, and think before you write something in an email that you can't call back. Same thing with any kind of social media or anything like that. You got to be careful with. The school district has invested a lot of money in the TEACH program. This is something for autism, TEACH program. Plus it has a communication component. The parent of a child with autism has requested the IEP team consider providing applied behavior services to the child. The parent has privately contracted with an ABA therapist to provide services to her child during the summer and calls an ARC meeting at the beginning of school to present the ABA therapy option to the ARC team. Student's making good progress. What do? Tell the parent that the student's making good progress, and therefore you're sure the school district would never invest money in another program as it has so much already invested in the TEACH program. Or tell the ABA therapist that the mother brings to the meeting you don't agree with her methods, and therefore you recommend that the IEP team not consider that program for the student. Or go over the present levels of performance at the beginning of the meeting, showing her child's progress, listen to the mother and therapist presentation, have an ARC discussion about the child's progress, and determine if ABA therapy is needed in order for him to have faith. So probably that last one there, tell the ABA therapist, look at what's going on, see if you can incorporate that. Now, ABA therapy is something you can really get yourself into maybe some problems with because of the intensity and the duration of that program. Lots of times the data and the research says that has to be offered a lot in order for it to make an impact. So you're not going to be able to provide that's beyond your scope in a public school, but you may be able to take some of those elements and provide some of those elements that would maintain some of that the student has, some of that progress that student's made. So that would certainly be a proper response. A parent of a special education student with whom you attend church calls you in tears. She asserts to you that her child with autism is not making meaningful progress and that she is very concerned for the child's future. She requests that you use clout with your school staff at the IEP meeting in order to get the team to determine that the school district needs to pay for an outside reading program. She wants the outside reading teacher to come in during the school day and supplant the student's school reading program. Is there anything that you could do wrong with this scenario? And certainly you would want to be, let's go back and look at that. You would want to be not doing something like this. Your programs, you need to support and stay behind and not provide any kind of special attention or special privilege for anyone. Once you provide special privilege for one student, it opens a can of worms to provide special situations for all students. And all your decisions in an ARC meeting must be based on data. You can't just take what the parent says and go with it because of who the parent is. During an ARC meeting, the parent requests that her child with an IEP be allowed to take a school iPad home in order to assist with schoolwork. You say, we don't let any kid do that. Is that a problem? Which is the correct choice below? Ideal law requires a program individualized to the student's needs. Ideal law says that if a student with an IEP needs to take assistive technology home in order to receive FAPE, the IEP team must provide that. This is an IEP decision, not based on the child just wanting to take it home, but based on whether the student actually needs the iPad in order for them to assist them in IEP goals. I think it's the bottom one. We need to consider it and see if it's appropriate. We're at 11:58. I'm going to open it for questions. If you have questions, make sure you refer to the chat box and look for that Google Classroom that has some information in it. We can provide you with, and we'll also provide you with this PowerPoint. I'll place the PowerPoint in that Google Classroom as well, so you'll have some access to it. So I'm going to stop the share there. It's been a good meeting. I appreciate your time. As promised, we are going to end at 12. And, it's always good for us to go back through these things, think about these things, and be on our toes as we head into these ARC meetings, whether they're by virtual means or by face-to-face means. And if you get into a spot and you need some backup, we can help you with that. We would be completely happy to do so. And if we can't find the answer for you, we don't know all the answers, I can promise you, because this is a vast just vast area. To know everything about it is just impossible. But we have resources and people we can get a hold of. And, Teresa Combs is one of those people. And, of course, Brenda Combs at the co-op is such a experienced person and has so much to offer. We can always call upon her. And then I would encourage you that if you get in a situation where you feel like you need backup, reach out to your director and then reach out to us. I appreciate it. We're going to stop right there, and it's been a good meeting. If you have questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. Otherwise, have a good day. Have a good start to the school when you do finally get in-person school. Wish you the best. And if you need anything, always reach out to us. My email is denny.may@pikeville.kyschools.us. As always, we've sent you things. Gina sent you some things. I forwarded things. I think she CC'd me in the last one. So you've got my email there. And feel free to reach out to Brenda as well. Brenda.combs2@hazard.kyschools.us or dion.bates@hazard.kyschools.us as we seek to provide you with the most support we can, and we're always happy and willing to do so. Thank you very much, and have a great day.